God save the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is the I Don't Belong Here show, and I am your host, Samantha Beningo. I am a behavioral scientist, a career psychotherapist, a sixth-year, PhD candidate in clinical psychology, and a master's level psychologist. And I am currently here breaking down all things the Karen Read murder case. Welcome back. We are now on the eve of opening statements in this trial. I know we are all very excited, cannot wait for things to get started. It is going to truly be an adventure. And in honor of that, in honor of opening statements tomorrow, I am going to start today. What I want to do today is take a look at these rulings that Judge Beverly Cannoni made about what the defense is and is not allowed to do in their opening statements tomorrow. And then take a look at Yannetti's opening statement from last time and see if we can't figure out, whether that would be a sufficient opening statement, what we think of that opening statement, and then we will be able to tomorrow really see these two side by side and get a real feeling for how this trial might actually be quite different this time around. So this is going to be fun. I'm very excited. I cannot wait to get started. So let us do that now. From watching this case and just the way that Massachusetts law is set up, and if I'm putting my juror hat on and thinking about how the jury is experiencing the information that they're getting during the trial, it's challenging because you realize that so much gets lost in the weeds. And this is what makes opening statements so critical, because opening statements are essentially putting on your radar, your brain's radar. There is a part of your brain called the reticular activating system. And what it's doing is telling you what to pay attention to. It's the reason why if I'm on a Alaskan cruise ship and I happen to see somebody way off in the distance on the boat with a navy blue t-shirt and the number 2 on the back, I am very likely to think that is someone who is a fellow Yankee fan, who has a worship relationship with Derek Jeter also. And therefore, I'm going to notice it. But having had several, many, many more than I could count friends who could give a crap about baseball, they probably wouldn't even notice that shirt, right? That's the difference between me and you and what we all discern is important as we look out into the world. Now, opening statements is essentially the defense and the prosecution's opportunity to tell the jury what to focus on as they go through the trial. You're essentially putting it on into their brain in the reticular activating system and saying, all right, focus on this as we go through. So these are critical because they are very much telling the jury what to look for as we go through the trial. And I keep coming back to the whole thing about the key cycles, the cross-examination that Alan Jackson did of Trooper Paul, which, that evidence could have exonerated Karen Read right then and there, but because it just fell flat, because Trooper Paul is such an incredible moron, he didn't even understand what Alan Jackson was saying. And eventually he had no choice, Alan Jackson, but to kind of give it up because it just was a worthless effort at that point. But the point itself is critical, because if the Commonwealth is saying that Karen Read backed into John O'Keefe at 24 miles per hour for 60 feet, and that came from Trooper Paul, and that is a key cycle where Karen Read didn't have the car, wasn't even in her possession, then yeah, that's pretty important evidence that would exonerate her. But it just fell through the cracks.
If your testing occurred at key cycle 1164, that means you turn the engine on, the ignition on to start your testing, correct?
Correct.
And that triggering event that we see up there at 1164 initiated your testing, is that right?
Yes.
All right. So that 1164 is where that's where there's no more unknowns, in other words. Right? You know exactly where the car is, who's in the car, who turned the car on, and what the triggering events were and what they reflected, because you did it, correct?
Correct.
It's you.
Yes.
So that would be the cornerstone, basically, of your entire analysis of the key cycles.
Say again.
The cornerstone, in
Like-
other words, the one known that is immovable, it's immutable, is 1164 began your testing. Is that right?
Objection.
Is that right? I'm going to allow the question.
Yeah, that's when the car was in state custody.
All right. So starting at 1164 and counting backward, before you started your testing, you know that the SUV had to be started, the ignition had to be turned over, and it was driven to the Sally Port in Canton at 5:31 p.m. from a tow truck on January 29th, correct?
I didn't know that.
You did or did not?
Did not know that.
Okay. Assuming that the car had to be started and put on a tow truck, that would be key cycle what?
I don't know how. I can't speak to the fact that recorded a key cycle at that time.
I can't hear you.
I can't speak to the fact that we would record a key cycle at that time.
Okay. If the car was turned on and driven onto a tow truck, would that be a key cycle?
I don't know because these keys record different ways, so I can't speak to how or why it did not record on there. All I can speak to is that those are the key cycles. The odometer mileage is more what I was going after on this whole thing.
Trooper Paul, you just said unequivocally, when a car is turned on and then turned off, there's a key cycle.
I said when the car without the ignition on, that's a key cycle.
Right.
That's correct.
That's what I mean, when it's turned on, when the engine turns on.
That's the definition of what it is. I can't speak to why it didn't go on, why it did not record.
Well, let's talk about the ignition cycles
Okay.
before 1164, okay?
Okay.
Obviously, the car had to get to Canton PD because you saw it there, correct?
Correct.
Assume for purposes of my question, the car was turned on, and there's a video of it turning on, driving up onto a flatbed tow truck.
Yes.
That would be ignition cycle, I'm gonna use your word, key cycle, ignition cycle, 1163, correct?
Again, ignition cycle, key cycles are two different things.
Which word do you want me to use?
If you want to talk about key cycles, key cycles. If you want to talk about ignition cycles, it's ignition cycles when the vehicle gets turned on. A key cycle does not mean to be turned on.
But every single ignition cycle includes a key cycle. You can't have an ignition cycle without a key cycle, correct?
Well, if you want to talk about it, just use the key cycles or ignition cycles. I'm trying to make sure this gets out. I'm sorry. I'm trying to make sure that this gets put out the correct way.
Every ignition cycle includes a key cycle, correct?
In a sense.
By definition, it has to, right?
If you want to talk about it, just use the key cycles or ignition cycles. I'm trying to make sure this gets out. I'm sorry. I'm trying to make sure that this gets put out the correct way.
You also have to keep in mind in Massachusetts, they cannot go back and look at testimony. They can't watch videos. They can't get transcripts read back to them. All they have is their notes. And so it's really, really important that they either take good notes or really pay attention during opening statements, because it's going to inform how they perceive the rest of the trial. So these are really important. The opening statements, I mean, I don't even know if there's a way to stress how important they really are, because it cannot be overstated. They are essentially driving the direction of what the jury is going to be looking for. And because you can get lost in the weeds so easily, it's key that that is done right and done well. So let's look at the limitations that have been placed on the defense by Judge Beverly Cannoni. So the judge ruled that the defense opening statements cannot accuse other people of John O'Keefe's death by name, that they are prohibited from mentioning any potential third-party culprits in opening statements. They're not allowed to blame somebody else by name, though they are allowed to wage a third-party culprit defense. And they can name somebody by name if they have actual evidence to support that that person killed John O'Keefe. So you do with that what you will. I don't know what we're supposed to make of those. Those seem like contradictory rulings. Call me crazy. Maybe they're not. Maybe we just need to consult an attorney on this one. But it seems to me like on one hand, Judge Beverly Cannoni ruled they cannot name any specific people as indicated in the death of John O'Keefe. And they can name somebody if they have sufficient evidence to prove it during the trial. What does that mean? I have no idea. It means very little, I think. So, with that in mind, let's go back and let's take a look at David Yannetti's opening statements from the first trial. And maybe we can listen carefully for whether or not they did name somebody specifically during the first trial, or if it was just a general third-party culprit sort of defense, or how they framed what was coming on the defense side during the first trial. Now, remember, tomorrow, Alan Jackson will be doing the opening statements. So it won't be Yannetti this time. But Yannetti, from what I remember, did a good job. I just don't remember the details. I showed up about 2 weeks in, so I didn't see Yannetti's opening in real time. It's going to be fun to watch it here, especially with the juxtaposition of seeing Alan Jackson's opening statement tomorrow. So this should be really interesting. And with that, let's take a look.
Karen Reed was framed. Her car never struck John O'Keefe. She did not cause his death. And that means that somebody else did. You will learn that it was no accident that John O'Keefe was found dead on the front lawn of 34 Fairview Road in Canton on January 29th of 2022. You will learn that at that address lived a well-known and well-connected law enforcement family in Canton, the Alberts. Because the Alberts were involved, and because they had close connections to the investigators in this case, Karen Reed was framed for a murder she did not commit. Good morning again, ladies and gentlemen. As I previously told you, my name is David Yannetti. I'm an attorney with an office in Boston. Together with attorneys Alan Jackson and Elizabeth Little, it is truly my privilege and my honor to represent Karen Reed during this trial. From a very early juncture in this case, you will question the Commonwealth's theory of the case. You will question the quality of the Commonwealth's evidence. You will question the veracity of the Commonwealth's witnesses. And you will question their shoddy and biased investigation, a faulty investigation that led to Karen Reed sitting here today.
All right, so let's stop it for 1 second. So we do see right off the bat, not only are they saying that in this first opening statement, Karen Reed was framed, they also mention the Alberts. Now, I don't know if they're going to name Brian Albert specifically, but they do mention the Alberts. And so that makes us right off the bat have to ask the question, is tomorrow's, are they going to be allowed to do the same thing tomorrow? So keep that in mind, and let's go back to it.
You will learn, in short, that the police did no real investigation of this case, and you will question why. You'll question why the investigators had such tunnel vision. You will question why they focused solely on Karen Reed, someone with no ties to the Canton Police Department, as opposed to the well-known and well-connected Albert family of Canton, a family that was never treated as suspects by the investigators in this case. Boston police officer John O'Keefe was found mortally injured on Brian Albert's front lawn. His body was in full view and almost right below Brian Albert's bedroom window on his front lawn. He was found wearing only one sneaker. You'll learn that Brian Albert was a Boston police officer as well, and that he was a trained first responder. Brian Albert was notified that another police officer was injured and unresponsive on his front lawn, and Brian Albert did nothing. His sister-in-law, Jennifer McCabe, and other civilians were on his property that morning after John O'Keefe's body was found. Police, EMTs, firefighters, police cruisers, an ambulance, fire truck, lights flashing. And first responder Brian Albert never came out of his house. Equally important for you will be the fact that the lead homicide investigators never went inside the Albert home that night.
All right, so we have mention of Brian Albert. I mean, doesn't get much more direct than that, right? Brian Albert, first responder, didn't come out of the house. Right off the bat, we do have a person directly named. Interesting.
You'll learn that Brian Albert's brother, Kevin Albert, is a Canton police officer. It was obvious very early on that the Canton police should not be investigating the death of a man found on the property of the brother of a Canton police officer. So it was decided just about from the start that the Massachusetts State Police should take complete control of this investigation because the Canton police were conflicted out. Now, that sounded good at the time, but you'll learn that two major problems arose. First, despite the fact that they obviously had a conflict of interest, the evidence will show that the Canton police still had their hands in this investigation.
Mm-hmm.
You will find it astounding. But Canton police officer Kevin Albert, the reason for the conflict of interest in the first place, was continually updated about the status of this investigation while it was going on. Second, and equally troubling, is that the lead state police detective who was assigned to this case was a man named Michael Proctor. Michael Proctor, you will learn, is one of the many people in Canton with deep ties to the Albert family. Michael Proctor's own mother refers to the Alberts as the Proctor's second family.
Mm-hmm.
His own sister's wedding, Michael Proctor was in the wedding party with Colin Albert. And he sat at the head table of that wedding with members of the Albert family.
Now, one thing, Colin Albert is mentioned here, and we know that the judge took Colin off the table in terms of being able to directly imply that Colin Albert had some part to play in John O'Keefe's death. Now, it'll be interesting to see, what does that mean practically? Does that change anything or not? I mean, based on the fact that Beverly Cannoni made the ruling, they're not allowed to name anybody specifically, but then also simultaneously made a ruling that says you can name somebody if there is actual evidence of wrongdoing on the part of that person. So what does that mean? I mean, obviously, you can't just throw out people's names and say they're the ones that did it if they didn't, and if there was no evidence to support that. So this is confusing to me. I still have no idea whether or not these opening statements that Yannetti is giving right now, if that would count. I mean, did he say that Colin Albert did it, or is he just mentioning the name Colin Albert? I mean, this is tough to take or tough to discern, right? I mean, it's tough to be able to make that determination. I don't know what counts and what doesn't.
The man who was chosen to lead the investigation into the suspicious death on the property of Brian Albert. That's the man who gave updates to Canton police officer Kevin Albert, while the state police were supposed to be investigating what had occurred at his brother Brian Albert's house. You'll learn that right from the jump, Michael Proctor predetermined the outcome of this case. Never stepped foot inside the Albert home on January 29th, 2022.
Or
Never
any
checked
other
out
time.
whether there were any signs of struggle inside that home. He never called for crime scene technicians and other specialists to look for blood or other trace evidence within the home. He never asked Brian Albert for permission to go in the home and take a look around. Michael Proctor never applied for a search warrant to go in that home. Instead, he focused immediately and exclusively on Karen Reed, the outsider. You will learn that no one in the Proctor family has ever called the Reed family their second family. No one in the Proctor family had been in a wedding party with anyone from the Reed family.
Mm-hmm.
Karen Reed was a convenient outsider. She was most definitely not from Canton. So how did Michael Proctor feel about her? How did he treat somebody he was investigating at a point in time when he should have been keeping an open mind and focusing on obtaining all possible evidence so that he didn't miss anything? Well, you will learn that on the very day that John O'Keefe was found dead on Brian Albert's lawn, Michael Proctor was texting with his high school buddies about this supposedly secret investigation using his personal cell phone. He was revealing information about this investigation to his friends, assuming that nobody would ever find out what he was doing and what he was saying. And he was revealing his true thoughts about Karen Reed to his friends, not what he put in his sanitized police reports, his true feelings to his friends whom he trusted, and in text messages that he never thought would come into the hands of the defense in this case. Lead investigator Trooper Michael Proctor, right from the start, called Karen Reed names you would reserve only for your worst enemies.
Mm-hmm.
He told his friends that he hoped that she would kill herself.
Okay, so you wonder, I mean, they're naming Michael Proctor. They're not saying that Michael Proctor killed John O'Keefe, but I'm assuming that would be totally a fine thing to do because they're not saying that Proctor killed John. And that's what the ruling was specifically by Judge Bev, right? She's only speaking to their ability to name names as to who the third party culprits are. Not necessarily that they can't say that the lead investigator was corrupt or biased or whatever else, right? So far, and even when they mention Brian Albert, I'm not sure that would count either. Does that count? Does just mentioning the fact that John O'Keefe was found dead on the front lawn of Brian Albert, is that inadmissible? I mean, I would think that was okay. That's a fact. I mean, that is what happened, right? So how can they not mention that? I don't know. These are the things that will be interesting to see tomorrow.
He told his friends that he had seized her cell phone. And you will learn that he knew he shouldn't have been accessing any content on her cell phone because he knew there would likely be attorney-client communications on between Karen and me at that time. He knew that he was supposed to wait for a search warrant or other permission from a judge in order to go through that phone. But you'll learn that he went through the phone anyway, without permission.
Yep.
And you'll know that he did because he told his high school buddies that he was searching her phone for nude photos of Karen Reed. And he was disappointed he hadn't found any yet.
Oh, look at her laughing. Look at Peg
That
O'Keefe laughing in
is
the
the
background. I'm sorry. Did you see her? Did you see Peg O'Keefe laughing in the background? Like that's funny. You know, it's tough because I don't want to say anything bad about John's family. I really don't. Like I'm not trying to point that out to say something negative about them, but it does say something that his mother thinks it's funny that he was looking for nudes of Karen Reed. It does speak to exactly the point that the defense is making, which is it's this little exclusive club. I was going to say something unpleasant there. I'm going to just reserve. I'm going to just zip. Not going to say it. But there is this club of locals, right, who have that local towny mentality here. And everybody else, right, Karen, of course, being the ringleader, is on the outs. They're the outsider. So this is the point that Karen's defense team is making right now. And then you have Peg O'Keefe in the background laughing. And I always make this point, but I think it's probably fair to say it again. You know, even if Karen had killed John, do you think that John is sitting up in wherever, somewhere, saying, you know, Mom, Dad, I really want to make sure that you destroy the life of my girlfriend who, worst case scenario, accidentally hit me with her car? Now, we all know that's not what happened. But worst case scenario would have been an accident. I mean, clearly she didn't do this on purpose. And anybody who believes that she did this on purpose doesn't just, you know, it's too stupid to even have an opinion, to be fair. You know, doesn't know what they're talking about, doesn't know anything about anything, and is purely just angry and wanting to you know, rah for whatever reason, whatever investment they have, because Karen Reed did not do this on. One thing that you can say, that I can say with 100% certainty, if Karen Reed actually did kill John, it was 100% an accident. That is without a doubt, right? So I am more than 150% certain on that. Do I have any doubt whatsoever? I would say I'm 99.9% sure Karen Reed didn't do this. But I am 150% sure that she didn't do it on purpose, if she had done it at all.
An unbiased investigator who was chosen to lead the investigation into the death of John O'Keefe. You will learn that one of Michael Proctor's high school friends commented to him that with a dead body on the front lawn, the homeowner in this case is surely going to catch a lot of grief. And do you know what Michael Proctor's response to that was? One word.
Nope.
Nope. And he explained why. Michael Proctor assured his buddies that the homeowner would not catch a lot of grief because, quote, the homeowner's a Boston cop too, end quote. That one sentence, ladies and gentlemen, in Michael Proctor's own words, will explain a lot to you about how this investigation was conducted. You will be able to evaluate whether Trooper Michael Proctor treated Brian Albert and his family differently because of who they are and their relationships between his family and theirs. You will evaluate whether this investigation was on the up and up. You will decide, as a result, how valuable or worthless the prosecution's DNA evidence is or is not, in light of who controlled that evidence.
Well, not only that,
You
but
will
let's
learn
talk
that
about
Michael
the
Proctor's
DNA. I
fingerprints
mean,
are figure.
first of all, the DNA, the DNA had 5 contributors, 2 contributors, 4 contributors. Like, hello, right? What DNA evidence? Oh my God, such a disgrace. Sorry. It's tough to hear, right? It's tough. It's tough to take this.
Figuratively all over this case. His fingerprints are all over the Commonwealth's evidence. You will learn that Michael Proctor showed up at Karen Reed's parents' house in Dighton to interview her during the afternoon of January 29th, only hours after John O'Keefe's body was found dead on Brian Albert's front lawn. You'll learn that Michael Proctor had her Lexus SUV towed from her parents' home. But you'll also learn that he wrote a search warrant in which he falsified the time that he took that SUV.
Yes, he did.
He swore under oath that the vehicle wasn't towed until 5:30 p.m. But you'll learn that we obtained surveillance footage that he didn't know we would get. And that surveillance footage exposed that Michael Proctor's words in that sworn affidavit were a lie. Michael Proctor had that vehicle for about 90 minutes before he claimed to have taken it. And folks, you will learn that the timing is important, very important. Because when John O'Keefe was first found on Brian Albert's front lawn, the police thoroughly searched that yard for potential evidence. And it wasn't just one officer, or two, or three. There were at least 4 officers that searched that front lawn. And that morning was the beginning of a snowstorm, but there wasn't yet much snow on the ground when they were searching that lawn. It was light out by the time they did the search, and it was getting lighter. And during that thorough search of Brian Albert's front lawn, the number of pieces of taillight that were found by a minimum of 4 officers looking for evidence was 0. It was only later in the day, when the snow was really starting to accumulate, that the police miraculously started to find pieces of taillight on the property. The police only started to find pieces of taillight after Michael Proctor had seized Karen Reed's car. They only started to find pieces of taillight after Michael Proctor had possession of her taillight. You'll learn that Trooper Michael Proctor then kept going back to the Albert residence after that day, and he claims to have kept finding pieces of taillight on multiple occasions on multiple different days. And in addition, a good week after John O'Keefe's death, Canton Police Chief Kenneth Berkowitz, an older officer on the brink of retirement with probably not the best eyesight, he supposedly was driving, happened to be driving past Brian Albert's house. And by the way, Brian Albert is someone with whom Chief Berkowitz is also good friends. And this older man allegedly spotted yet another piece of taillight from his moving vehicle. This was yet another piece of taillight that was somehow missed by the trained specialists who had previously and thoroughly searched the property. Another piece of taillight that Proctor supposedly missed in the many times he went back to the property. Michael Proctor claims that he kept finding pieces of taillight right up until February 18th of 2022, which was nearly 3 weeks after John O'Keefe was found dead on Brian Albert's home. You will learn that there is no competent evidence that Karen Reed's taillight shattered at Brian Albert's property in the early morning hours of January 29th of 2022. To the contrary, you'll learn that when Karen left John at Brian Albert's house, she drove back to John's house on Meadows Ave across town in Canton. At John's home, where he lived with his 2 adopted children, Karen was drifting in and out of sleep, but she woke up for good in a panic sometime around 4 a.m. because John hadn't come home. And that was not like him at all. He had never done that before. Karen had a sinking feeling that something was wrong. Something was seriously wrong. So she got back into her Lexus, and she backed up out of the garage to leave the driveway. And when she did, the right rear taillight of her Lexus struck John's parked vehicle in the driveway, and her taillight cracked. That was the same taillight that the prosecution now claims was broken outside the Albert residence hours earlier at 12:38. But we have video evidence that the taillight was actually broken at 5 a.m., many hours after the prosecution needs that taillight to have been broken. There is, of course, no video of the taillight being broken at Brian Albert's house. You will eventually conclude that that's because the taillight was not broken there. Importantly, you will learn that there was an eyewitness who arrived at 34 Fairview after Karen got there with John O'Keefe in the early morning hours of January 29th. And that eyewitness, Brian Nagel, who's the brother of Julie Nagel, who was at the after-hours party that night. He had a clear view of Karen's SUV. Brian Nagel confirms that there was no damage to her taillight at that time. Karen was sitting in the driver's seat with her hands at 10 and 2. And Ryan Nagel confirms that while Karen was inside the car, John O'Keefe was not. John O'Keefe was also not outside the car at that time. you will ultimately conclude there's only one other place he could have been. Now, going back to that 5 a.m. video from John's driveway, you will see Karen back up her Lexus and strike John's car at about 5 a.m. when she was leaving John's house to go out to look for him. And you will know that she struck his car at 5 a.m. because you will watch that video closely. You will witness that the wheels and the hubcaps on John's car are jostled and moved by Karen's SUV. And you will conclude that that video depicts exactly when Karen's taillight was cracked, long after she dropped off John that night at 34 Fairview. And you will learn that part of the reason that Karen's Lexus hit John's car was that Karen was panicked at that time. Where is John? Why didn't he come home? What happened to him? And you will learn that she was racking her brain for what possibly could have happened. And like many of us, was worried about the worst. Did I hit him? Could I have hit him? That was what she was saying, both to herself and to other people later that morning when she went back to 34 Fairview.
So wait, I just
I
want
couldn't
to,
think of anything else that made sense.
I want to address this
You certainly-
because this is another argument that Karen Reed haters like to make, right? Why would Karen immediately jump to, could I have hit him? Could I have hit him? And the answer to that is really, honestly, it's a psychological answer. Karen has narcissistic tendencies. And what narcissistic tendencies means is not only that they're kind of self-involved, but that the only world that they understand is one that reflects them directly. So there would never be, like, if it were me, okay, yes, it's true that if I were Karen in that case and I had just dropped John off and he never came back into the car, obviously I would never assume that I hit him because I would know whether or not I hit him, right? And it probably wouldn't even come into my mind. I obviously would know if I hit him. So, however, a number of I've mentioned this before, but two things about Karen you have to know. One is, yeah, she's a little narcissistic. So everything is about her. Doesn't matter what we're talking about. Anything that Karen is thinking about, regardless of what it is going to reflect her. And it's either going to be a projection where whatever she's got going on the inside is going to, for her, appear to her as though it's external. It's going on the outside, right? So if she's feeling like I shouldn't have left him there, if there's any sense of guilt or doubt, oh my God, what if he walked home and he got hit by a plow? Or what if he fell asleep because he was so drunk and he was trying to walk and he just passed out in the snow? Any sense of guilt about, her behavior leading up to finding him that morning would have been projected into the world. And so on one hand, part of the reason why Karen would have naturally blamed herself is because she's narcissistic. The other side of that equation is that she was in a brownout. And how do we know she was in a brownout? I've talked about this many times, but because there's a lot of indicators going back to the text messages, the fight that she had in Aruba on New Year's Eve into January 1st, the conversations that she's having with Brian Higgins, all the way through, and then the conversations she's having in that fight with John and the text messages on the day, January 28th, 2022. All of those give us indicators that when Karen drinks too much, she browns out. She doesn't have a complete memory. And if you remember when she was talking to Higgins, at one point, Higgins thinks that maybe John is trying to trick him and playing Karen on the phone because she doesn't remember 100% whether that she had kissed him or not. And so he thinks that maybe like she's screwing with him or John is pretending to be Karen. So he doesn't answer that question, yes or no, until he once again believes it's Karen he's talking to. But the reason she doesn't remember is because she experiences brownouts. She has some memory, but it's not complete. And the same thing is true here. Okay, so, and again, if I'm very narcissistically oriented to the world, not just that I'm selfish, that's not how I mean it exactly. How I mean it is that like the world is a reflection of me in its entirety. For people that are narcissistic, there's no separation between their experience and the world outside. It's almost like there's no objectivity. Like they have a really hard time looking at something and not seeing its relationship to them in some way that means something for them, right? So that is also the reason why that morning where uh, John's mother, Peg O'Keefe, made that statement about why did you leave him at the house, or she immediately, when Karen walks into John's house after they find out that he's passed, why Karen acts really strange is because at that time she doesn't have a full memory of what had happened, and she was worried that she must have hurt him in some way, or maybe it was her fault, whether it's because she left him there or because she hit him. I mean, she just didn't know. That's why she was carrying that guilt. That's why she left, because it was shame and guilt internally. Now, with time and distance and a phone call from Scanlon, somebody who knew the Alberts and either heard directly or indirectly or extrapolated whatever, that there were something nefarious happened in the house, Karen wasn't thinking about what was going on in the world where she was not a part of it, because that's not how Karen thinks. Karen doesn't see the world objectively. She sees it as a reflection of her. And that is really important. That's why, you know, when people jump down her throat, or where people make these suggestions that that she's essentially knows she's guilty and that she's covering up for that guilt. That's like what Paul O'Keefe was saying. Oh, I just know she was acting weird, and so she's guilty. She was acting weird because she was carrying guilt, but not because she hit him, simply because she didn't know how to explain what happened to him and doesn't remember clearly what happened. And because she's a narcissist, sorry, I don't want to be judgy, because she has narcissistic tendencies, she assumed she must have had something to do with it. Okay? Really important to keep that in mind. There is no world outside for Karen Reed. So it never would have dawned on her to think about what happened in the house. And what's crazier about that, the more I think about it, the crazier that is, because she must have been really drunk to not realize that Brian Higgins was going to the house, and that she was essentially dropping John off at a house where the guy that she's been flirt texting with for the last 2 weeks, where he is, who she just ignored at the waterfall for the last hour. But, you know, Karen, it clearly didn't come into her mind. She obviously didn't have much of a reservation leaving John there, because, you know, another way to think about this is, what if Karen had gone into the house? Right? Because I think it's possible, and I can't say for sure, but if I dropped my boyfriend off and he was going to text me to tell me whether or not I should come in, and then he doesn't, rather than leave and get angry, I probably would have went inside. I probably would have parked, knocked on the front door and said, "Hey, is John here?" Right? So that's probably what I would have done. That's not what she did. She immediately assumed that he was doing something nefarious, that he was, you know, flirting or partying and had just forgotten about her, whatever. And so she leaves in kind of a rage and gets more and more angry as she drives off and is now winds up back at John's house. So that's the answer to the question. Why does Karen say, could I have hit him? Could I have hit him? It's because of her personality. It's really not because she hit him.
I didn't consider in a million years that someone from within the Albert home could have beaten up John and left him to die on the front lawn. Now, that was over 2 years ago. Karen didn't know then what you will learn during this trial. Karen didn't know that Brian Albert's sister-in-law, Jennifer McCabe, left the after-hours party at Brian Albert's house sometime after Karen pulled away. She didn't know that after Jennifer McCabe dropped off some people elsewhere, she returned to her own home. Karen didn't know that Jennifer McCabe climbed some stairs in her home and eventually made it into her bedroom with her cell phone. Karen didn't know that Jennifer McCabe settled in at 2:27 in the morning on January 29th, 2022, and typed a Google search that she would later delete. 2:27 in the morning was over 3 hours before John O'Keefe's body was found on Brian Albert's lawn. 2:27 was over 3 hours before anyone knew or suspected that John O'Keefe was missing.
All right, so now we have an introduction to Jen McCabe. And again, I have to believe that this would be admissible based on Judge Bev's ruling, because there is evidence to support that Jen McCabe did absolutely do that Google search. I mean, that comes down to a battle of experts, but from everybody that I've spoken to, that happened, and there's no way around it. So they can bring in however many people, Commonwealth people that want to blow smoke up their bum, but this Google search happened. I mean, there's no question about it. And it was found in a deleted state, everybody. Yeah. Anyway, so this is evidence that they have as direct. So why couldn't they bring Jen McCabe's name up? They should very well be able to bring her up. They're also not suggesting that she killed John. They are simply suggesting that she had knowledge of what had happened to John long before Karen certainly did.
Missing or hurt or in trouble. And at 2:27 in the morning, you will learn that with no one watching her, thinking she was alone with her thoughts, and not worrying that anyone would know what she was doing, Jennifer McCabe typed in the following Google search: how long to die in the cold? Now, she misspelled the first word, so the actual search was "long to die in the cold," but you'll get the point. You will ask yourself, why would somebody Google how long does it take for someone to die in the cold, unless that person knew someone who either was in that situation or would be in that situation? You will question during this trial, who was it who actually did die in the cold at some point that night, sometime after Jen McCabe was asking Google for an answer to her question? And you'll learn that the answer to that question was John O'Keefe. The medical examiner in this case will testify that one of the causes of John O'Keefe's death was hypothermia. John O'Keefe died in part because he was left to die in the cold. Now, the Commonwealth will try to dispute the timing of that Google search. They'll try to claim that there were only 2 Google searches at 6:23 and 6:24 a.m. after John's body was found. But one problem for the Commonwealth will be that we have retained Richard Green, one of the leading computer forensic experts in the country. Rick Green has forensically analyzed Jennifer McCabe's phone, both manually and using every appropriate type of computer software to solve this issue. Rick Green will confirm for you that Jennifer McCabe did indeed make that search at 2:27 a.m. And another problem for the Commonwealth is that you will hear and see other evidence that will confirm that Jennifer McCabe is lying when she denies making that Google search at 2:27 a.m.
And something important to keep in mind about the Google search, the Commonwealth never found it, right? So they never, and if they did, they didn't mention it certainly, but they never found that search. So what does that tell you? Who do you think did a more thorough and complete job if that wall file never even came up on the search that Ian Whiffen, the big important guy who, had something to do with the software that all of these cell phone in forensic people are using, right? If he's so important to celebrate, then why didn't he know? How come he didn't see that the wall file was there? Whether it was at 2:27 or 6:20 or 6 whatever other time, 6:08, 6:10, 6:12, 6:20, right? So if their team is so much better than Richard Green, why didn't they even see that file was there?
You will conclude that before she went to bed, if she went to bed that night, Jennifer McCabe wanted to know just how long it would take for someone to die in the cold. And a big question in this trial for you will be, when was John O'Keefe left to die in the cold? I expect the Commonwealth will try to persuade you that he was left there sometime around 12:30 a.m. because they're going to try to prove to you that Karen Reed hit him and that his body stayed there the entire night until first responders arrived at 6 a.m. and his body was taken to the hospital. But you will learn that there are big problems with the Commonwealth's theory of this case. You will learn that there were 6 people at that after-hours party at Brian Albert's house, all of whom left by the front door and would have been confronted by John O'Keefe's lifeless body on that lawn if he was actually there at that time. Those 6 people walked out the front door to 34 Fairview, walked to their cars, either in the driveway or parked in front of the house. Brian Albert's sister-in-law, Jennifer McCabe, was there. Her husband, Matthew McCabe, was there. ATF federal agent Brian Higgins was there, who was also Brian Albert's friend. Sarah Levinson, a friend of Brian Albert Jr., was there. Julie Nagel, another friend of Brian Albert Jr., was there. And Caitlin Albert, Brian Albert's daughter, was also there. All of them leaving the residence. Each of those people left 34 Fairview in Canton, where Brian Albert lived. Each of them walked out facing the front lawn, where the Commonwealth will tell you that a 6'2", nearly 220-pound big man in dark clothing was sprawled on the front lawn when there was only a dusting of white snow on the ground. He was supposedly sprawled on that lawn, just feet from where these people were walking when they left the residence. And you will learn that not one of these people saw John O'Keefe laying. Not one. And you know who else saw no one laying outside in the early morning hours of January 29th? The snowplow driver in charge of plowing the street for the city of Canton. And this is another big problem for the Commonwealth. You will learn that Michael Proctor, here's that name again, wrote a report where he claimed that the DPW supervisor had told him that Fairview Road had not been plowed that night. Proctor's total investigation on this issue consisted of one phone call and no follow-up. He just submitted his report that simply said the road hadn't been plowed that night, perhaps thinking that no one else would follow up either. But you'll learn that when it came to finding out the truth, it's not that Proctor couldn't find the truth, it's that he wouldn't. But fortunately, you'll learn that we would, and we did. You'll learn that within weeks after January 29th, we sent our investigator, a former Medford police officer named Paul Makowski, to the Canton DPW to try to get to the bottom of this. Paul Makowski talked to the same supervisor at the DPW, a man named Michael Trotta, whom Proctor claimed had told him that the street hadn't been plowed that night. You'll learn that Paul Makowski found out that Michael Proctor was not telling the truth. You'll learn that Michael Trotta from the DPW told Paul Makowski, our investigator, that the street was indeed plowed that night, and that the name of the plow driver was Brian Loughran. So Paul Makowski tracked down Brian Loughran. He asked Mr. Loughran if the state police or any investigators had ever spoken to him. And the answer came back, no. You will then learn what Brian Loughran had to say about what he saw and didn't see that night, and you will be shocked. Brian Loughran told Paul Makowski that he was driving a big snowplow in Canton that night. You'll learn that the nickname for it at the DPW was Frankenstein because it had a lot of spare parts and it had been around forever. Brian Loughran told Paul Makowski that when he plows the streets of Canton in Frankenstein, he's very careful. He makes sure to check not only the roads in front of him, but also the yards to the side of his plow. He makes sure not to hit a fire hydrant or a tree or an animal, or heaven forbid, a person lying in the snow. He's always on the lookout. You'll learn that Brian Loughran passed by 34 Fairview in his plow, traveling right by Brian Albert's front lawn at 2:30 in the morning. You'll learn that Brian Loughran confirms that at about 2:30, when he went by that house, John O'Keefe was not on that front lawn. So you'll learn that about 2 hours after the Commonwealth claims that Karen Reed somehow incapacitated John O'Keefe, an eyewitness confirms that not only could it not have happened, but it didn't happen. But you'll learn that Brian Lawford also provides some other troubling testimony for the Commonwealth. You'll learn that after making that pass at 2:30 in the morning and seeing no body, he showed up again at the entrance to Fairview Road, intending to make another pass down it with his plow. This time, however, at about 3:30 in the morning, he looked down the street and he saw that parked right next to Brian Albert's front lawn, right in the very area where John O'Keefe's body was later found at 6 a.m., Brian Lawford saw a Ford Edge parked on the side of the road. You will learn that the police have done zero investigation to discover whose Ford Edge that was. You'll learn that members of the Albert family drove Ford Edges. You'll learn that the police to this day claim not to know who was parked right next to the area where John O'Keefe's body was later found. You will learn that while investigators on this case, including Michael Proctor, completely ignored the snowplow driver who went right by the Albert residence, the defense not only tracked him down and interviewed him, but the plow driver actually took our investigator on a ride back past the residence to explain the precise route that he had taken on January 29th. You'll learn that some other curious things were going on in the early morning hours of January 29th. Curious things that the police in this case utterly failed to investigate. For example, after people left the after-hours party at Brian Albert's house on January 29, Brian Albert claimed that he had no contact with anyone but his wife until he was woken up in the morning. But you will learn that he was ultimately confronted by the fact that his phone records revealed that he had actually placed a phone call to ATF agent Brian Higgins, his friend, the same friend who had been at his house earlier that night. And that was at 2:22 in the morning. You'll learn that Brian Higgins called him back 17 seconds later, and they connected for 22 seconds on their cell phones. You'll be asked to consider just how long 22 seconds is and what could be said and discussed during that long of a phone call. You will consider that phone call in the context of the other curious things that were going on during the early morning hours of January 29th. You will learn about the following in chronological order. 2:12 a.m., Jennifer McCabe arrives at her home. 2:22 a.m., Brian Albert calls Brian Higgins. 2:22 a.m., 17 seconds later, Higgins calls him back, and Brian Albert and Brian Higgins are on the phone together for 22 seconds. 2:23 a.m., Jennifer McCabe climbs the stairs to her bedroom. 2:27 a.m., Jennifer McCabe searches on Google how long to die in the cold. 2:30 a.m., plow driver Brian Lawford confirms there was no body on Brian Albert's front lawn. 3:30 a.m., Brian Lawford confirms that a Ford Edge was parked right where John O'Keefe's body was later found. The Commonwealth will not be able to successfully dispute any of those facts, yet I expect that they will persist in asking you to convict Karen Reed anyway. You will learn that there are other major problems with the Commonwealth's theory. You'll learn that when John O'Keefe was found, he did not look like he had been hit by a car.
That's a pretty big one.
You'll learn that he looked to have been attacked and beaten up. You'll learn that John O'Keefe was a large 6'2" man who, if positioned behind a Lexus SUV, would have had his torso completely exposed to the rear of that vehicle, including to the taillight. You'll learn that no part of his torso was injured. There was no bruising, no ridges, no scratches, no punctures. You'll learn that his chest and hips and legs were pristine, despite the Commonwealth's contention that he was hit by a 6,000-pound vehicle. The evidence will show that what was not pristine was his right arm. You will take one look at that arm, And you will conclude that a car did not cause those injuries.
It didn't.
The injuries to John O'Keefe's arm appear to be consistent with scratch marks and claw marks, marks that make it look as though an animal had attacked his arm. But you won't have to rely just on your common sense when you look at those photos. You'll hear from an expert forensic pathologist who is world-renowned, who has personally conducted thousands of autopsies. And he will testify that those marks are consistent with scratch and claw marks and bite marks from an animal, including a German Shepherd. You'll learn that on January 29th of 2022, Brian Albert's family dog, Chloe, was a German Shepherd. You'll learn that Brian Albert has admitted that this dog is not good around strangers. You'll learn that on January 29th of 2022, John O'Keefe would have been a stranger to that dog. And you'll learn that Chloe had been the beloved family dog for the Alberts for 7 years. The Albert family loved Chloe. But strangely, as we discuss this dog today, the Albert family doesn't have its beloved Chloe anymore. You'll learn that Brian Albert was called to testify before the grand jury regarding this matter in April of 2022, and that he did testify about his German Shepherd, Chloe, during that grand jury testimony. And you'll learn that not long after that testimony, Brian Albert and his family rehomed their beloved family dog. They gave away their family dog, and Chloe, the German Shepherd, is therefore now gone. Now, the Commonwealth will try to take your attention away from all of these troubling facts and try to persuade you not to consider their shocking lack of investigation of anyone else, not to consider John O'Keefe's injuries, not to consider the fact that multiple people left the residence and saw no body, not to consider the fact that the snowplow driver was specifically looking at 2:30 a.m. and there was no body there, not to consider the fact that two people in the house were communicating at 2:22 a.m. but denied speaking to each other for 22 seconds, and not to consider the fact that one of their witnesses, who was also present at the home, was unusually curious at 2:27 a.m. about how long it would take for someone to die in the cold. The Commonwealth will instead try to persuade you that Karen Reed supposedly had a motive to kill John O'Keefe because they were not getting along. You'll hear about their trip to Aruba over New Year's Eve and that Karen was upset that John had been flirting with another woman. And you will hear that Karen considered exploring her options after that trip, which led her to a get-together at one point with ATF federal agent Brian Higgins, although that never went anywhere. But you'll also hear that in January of 2022, after the Aruba trip,
oh my God, wait a minute.
Not long before January 28th,
Wait a second. Oh my God.
John
Did you see
O'Keefe was
this?
making
Wait.
long-term
Oh my
plans.
God. Oh my God. Oh my God. Did you see that? Man, I try not to over focus on the family because I just don't want to. I just don't want to see it. But I want to just go back a few seconds. I want you to watch Peg O'Keefe as he introduces the idea of Karen speaking to Higgins. Just watch her in the background. She's in the green dress, just behind Yannetti's left shoulder.
2 seconds, and not to consider the fact that one of their witnesses, who was also present at the home, was unusually curious at 2:27 a.m. about how long it would take for someone to die in the cold. The Commonwealth will instead try to persuade you that Karen Reed supposedly had a motive to kill John O'Keefe because they were not getting along. You'll hear about their trip to Aruba over New Year's Eve and that Karen was upset that John had been flirting with another woman. And you will hear that Karen considered exploring her options after that trip, which led her to a get-together at one point with ATF federal agent Brian Higgins, although that never went anywhere.
Here.
But you'll also hear that in January of 2022, after the Aruba trip, and not long before January 28th,
That appears to be new information for
John
Peg
O'Keefe was making long-term plans with Karen, including a family trip with her and the kids, and also another trip with Karen and another couple for months into the future. And you'll see video of how John and Karen were interacting on the night in question. You'll see for yourself how they looked at each other from the video at the waterfall that night. Nobody who saw them that night saw anything wrong. There was nothing wrong. I mean, like any couples, occasionally they would bicker or disagree, but you will hear zero evidence of any domestic violence in that home whatsoever. John never raised a hand in anger toward Karen, and Karen never raised a hand in anger toward John. That simply wasn't who they are. You will conclude the notion that Karen Reed chose the start of a snowstorm to suddenly become violent out of the blue for the first time and intentionally kill her boyfriend by hitting him with her car and leaving him there with a house full of people inside is patently ridiculous. You will also learn that what's not ridiculous is that someone, not Karen Reed, ambushed John O'Keefe. Somebody probably didn't mean to kill him, but somebody went too far. You'll learn that Trooper Proctor failed to investigate motives that other people had to harm John O'Keefe. You'll learn that Proctor failed to investigate anything or anyone who was in the Albert residence that night. You'll learn that he failed to investigate the antagonistic relationship between members of the Albert family and John O'Keefe. You'll learn that apparently nobody investigates the Albert family of Canton.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, on day one, Trooper Proctor was asked whether the homeowner, Brian Albert, would catch a lot of grief. And Trooper Proctor himself said it. Nope. Homeowner's a Boston cop too. So folks, the trial is now about to start and the witnesses are about to start testifying. On behalf of Karen Reed, I ask that you do two things during this trial. First, I ask that you pay attention to all of the evidence. The way trials work, the prosecution gets to present its case first. They conduct their direct examinations first. So we respectfully ask that you wait for us. We will get to cross-examine their witnesses, and you will find that cross-examination is the key that unlocks the truth. Wait for us. You'll be glad that you did. Second, I ask that you keep your eye on the ball. You have one job and one job only to do during this trial, and that job, quite frankly, is not to solve this case. Your only job during this trial is to determine whether the Commonwealth, the prosecution, has proven to you each and every element of the crimes they have charged, beyond a reasonable doubt, to a moral certainty. The prosecution will fail to prove this case to a moral certainty. They will fail to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. You will reasonably doubt their case because their theory of the case does not make sense.
That's true.
You will reasonably doubt their case because Karen Reed was framed, and the evidence shows that, despite the fact that the police never ever investigated that angle of this case at all. Mm-hmm. Because the prosecution will not prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt to a moral certainty, we will stand before you again at the end of this trial and ask that you find Karen Reed not guilty.
Good job. All right. Okay, stop sharing. There we go. Okay. What did you think? What'd you think? I thought that was a pretty good open, right? But it's interesting because he definitely tells us exactly what to be looking for, exactly what to pay attention to have these key bits on our radar so that when we're going through the monotony of the moment to moment grind that is this trial, we will be able to pick stuff out and say, oh, all right, yeah, this is the text message, or this is the Google search that Jen McCabe did. And, this is the relationship that Proctor had with whoever. And, oh, here's Proctor saying, that they want to buy gifts for him, or here's his text messages to his high school buddies. The thing is, I guess I just want to add one thing, or maybe a couple of things. First, I don't know. It just seems like there's so much more evidence now. And I'm not sure if that's because it's stuff that's come out since that opening statement, or if it's just because you have to essentially choose only a handful of very specific details to highlight. So you kind of like pick your best bits of evidence and you point to that. Because there is a lot more that wasn't, really talked about directly in there. I also have had this question, and if anybody knows anything about this, this would be a really interesting question to ask an expert in this matter. But a frostbite expert, someone who could tell us definitively how long it would take for a human body to get hypothermia and actually die from being left out in the cold. My understanding is that that can happen pretty fast. Certainly, if you're at like negative 20 degrees, it'll happen in, 40 minutes. But if you're at, let's say I don't know what the exact temperature was. I'm just being that I'm from New England. Let's just go ahead and say with the wind chill, it felt like 19 degrees. Now, that might be off. We'll look it up. But just for the sake of this discussion, if it's 19 degrees out, he's barely, he's wearing like jeans and a t-shirt, a long sleeve t-shirt. So he's not dressed for it. Okay. The truth is, if John was out there for that entire 6.5 hours, if she had hit him and he was lying there on the ground from 12:30 at night until almost 6:30 a.m., he would have definitely been dead, right? He would have been frozen solid. You would think that's a long time to be out like that. So to me, he probably was not outside for 6 hours. So that's another point that I would just love to hear some expert testimony on, because, I don't know if it matters. Maybe it's beside the point, but it just seems like maybe that could be an important detail. A couple other things. The forward edge. Now, if I remember correctly, and again, somebody correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I am pretty sure that at one point we find out that Colin Albert also has a forward edge, right? Because at some point, the plow driver, yes, he identifies the forward edge, but he also is able to identify that it's not Brian Albert's forward edge for whatever reason. It's a different color or whatever. But Colin Albert also apparently has a forward edge from what I remember. So that's interesting. It's interesting that Colin Albert also has a forward edge. And that, again, might be worth paying a little closer attention to. But yes, the other thing that, we talked about, obviously, is, he does name names there. We hear a lot about Brian Albert, and we do hear about the ATF agent. We hear about Jen McCabe and about her Google search. So there's some name dropping in there, and we even hear Colin Albert's name. So, I don't know, based on, Judge Bev's ruling, to me, it seems like this opening would do just fine, because he never actually says he did it, right? Or she did it. That's not, he never does that. He just, insinuates that there's strange things happening. There are strange events occurring in and around Canton, Massachusetts on the early morning hours of January 29th, 2022. So I have to believe that they would be able to have the exact same open tomorrow. Now, obviously, they are very much not going to do that. But my point is just that I think that would be admissible based on these seemingly contradictory rulings that the judges made here, right? On one hand, not allowed to directly point the finger at anybody. On the other, you can point the finger directly at somebody as long as there's evidence to prove it. So, which one is it? Clearly, you can't just point at somebody and say they did it. Like, I'm not going to randomly point at the person on the street and just say, yep, that poor schmuck is the one that killed John. I don't know. This just seems like, sometimes I think Bev does things like she feels like she has to throw a bone to, like, the Commonwealth. If the defense gets a win, it's like she's got to balance it out with some other, win for the prosecution next. I mean, it does very much seem like a lot of her rulings are not based on law or legal issues, but simply based on, like, who she just gave a ruling to last. I don't know. I still swear at some point I'm going to go back and try to go through every ruling that she's conducted so that we can kind of see what the score looks like, who she's ruled in favor of, and for what is the disproportionate averages. Also, one other thing that I really hope the defense brings up in the opening or at some point during this trial is that edited video, the one that had the blurs that we went over together. That would just be, to me, if I was a juror and I saw those blurs over the taillight, I would be losing my mind. I would be like they'd have to kick me off the jury, because my face, I would not be able to hide my disdain and sense of total, like, unbelievable injustice. And that's the other question. Okay, so here's another question. You guys, please, I need the answer to this question. So please, somebody answer this for me. What is the evidence that the Commonwealth has against Karen Read? What is the evidence? The taillight pieces that weren't there during the first search. So, okay. So the taillight pieces, which do not pass the reasonable doubt test. So we're just going to, so that's one. What else do they have? If you say DNA, then you also, though, have to point out that there's so many other people's DNA that they just didn't test. So does that prove anything? I mean, if John's DNA is on the car, what does that prove? There was 5 people's DNA on his sneaker. There was DNA all over his clothing that didn't belong to him. And by the way, that should have been in the open. Why is there DNA all over his clothes that we don't know who it belongs to? I mean, the list of stuff in this case, I mean, if reasonable doubt is the bar, I mean, this is just, you just have to pray that the defense presents it in a way that the jury can hear. But all right, so the DNA, I feel like at best, the DNA that exonerates Karen overrides whatever nonsense DNA they're claiming that they have of, like, the hair on the bumper of the car, which is absurd, just totally absurd. So, all right, what else? What is the other evidence that they have? Oh, Karen saying, "Could I have hit him?" Right. That's really it. So all they have the taillight, which is, I think, pretty easy to see is manufactured. They have DNA on a hair that somehow miraculously stayed on the bumper through, like, the worst snowstorm in New England in a decade, but nothing to see there. And the statements, "Could I have hit him?" That's what they have. And 2 out of those 3 are very likely to be planted. All they have is, "Could I have hit him?" And if they're going to try to claim consciousness of guilt, this is something I think I'm going to do a separate video on, this idea of consciousness of guilt, because it's something that, Brennan loves to bring up, that Karen Read's consciousness of guilt. But if you look at the behavior, just go back and watch like 10 minutes of the testimony of Jen McCabe, Colin Albert, talk about consciousness of guilt. Why in God's name would you be so defensive on the stand if you had nothing to do with this? If I'm Colin Albert, why do I have to have sudden amnesia if I have nothing to do with this? Why does my testimony need to be rehearsed? Why do I have to deny the butt dials? I mean, if I have nothing to do with this, what is the big deal? You're just asking me questions and I'm just reporting the truth. So you talk about consciousness of guilt. I mean, one of the biggest indicators that a crime really did happen here on the part of all of these witnesses is their consciousness of guilt. It's like they are doing so much bending over backwards to lie, to defend. You know, Jen McCabe arguing with Alan Jackson. It's like, what? Just answer his questions. If you didn't do anything wrong, what's the big deal? I don't know. It's so crazy, you guys. So, all right, there you have it. It'll be really interesting to see how opening statements tomorrow are different, how the defense's opening statements are different tomorrow than they were during the last trial. And I will be there with you watching with bells on. And hopefully we're going to be doing live soon. We're trying to get the approval from YouTube. And yeah, I had no idea that YouTube is so censorship like friendly. Did not realize that they were going to like give me all these warnings and whatever. So hopefully I'm learning quickly. It's a pretty fast learning curve. And hopefully we can get the lives going soon. Thank you so much for your time, your effort, and your attention. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment, subscribe, and I will see you on the other side of opening statements.
God save the Commonwealth of